Hello and welcome back to the Unlocking Love Summit. My name is Stephen. Lee is not with us today, but we are also joined by Marsha Means. She is a marriage and family therapist, coach, and author who specializes in betrayal trauma and sex addiction. She's the founder and director of Circle of Joy Ministries, and her life's passion is to help empower individuals and churches worldwide to provide hope and healing to those who have been impacted by trauma and sex addiction. Marsha, thank you so much for being here today, and it's such a pleasure to be speaking with you.
Hey, you're welcome. I'm grateful for the opportunity.
Well, we've had last time we spoke, we had a pretty in-depth conversation about one of your coaching programs. It definitely caught my interest. And you offer this coaching program for men. Um, Targeted specifically towards men who have acted out in infidelity um, or sex addiction. And your main focus of your program is empathy, So I thought that was really interesting. Out of all the things you could tailor a program around, you made the almost entire focus of your program about teaching these men empathy. Why did you structure your program that way, and why did you find that that was so important?
I didn't start there. I started decades ago working with wives, taking them through my workbook and trying to help them heal. And I did that for quite a long time. And I started to notice maybe 5 years ago, I'm not sure how long it's been, that there were some marriages of the women that were in my support groups to heal that weren't making it, even though the man was sober and going to all the meetings, doing everything he could. And so I started asking questions. And what I learned is the men were sober, but they did not know how to emotionally connect.
Mhm.
And what a woman really wants, what she expects to happen is if he gets sober, he's going to be back focused on me and we're going to have a really cool relationship. So when that didn't happen, they were devastated. And some of them have moved on, left the marriage. And so I learned everything I could about that. And I grew up in a home where we were well attached to, we were well bonded with our parents. So I knew what they were looking for, what those women were looking for. And I started with another coach's workbook, and I wasn't getting the result. I was getting some good results, but not the results I wanted. It's a shame for marriages to break up after they've gone through this horror together. I want to keep families together if I possibly can. And I started doing research and supplementing the material with some of my own. And previously, I've never worked with men. It's just a boundary that I kept for myself, that I'm a grandma and, soon to be even more than a grandma. So it's completely safe now. But I eventually published my own Learn Empathy, Help Your Betrayed Partner Heal last October. And I'm using that material, seeing wonderful results and a huge need for it. More people register than I can handle. So I think it's a really core issue. And what I've learned is that it's an intimacy disorder that drives sex addiction, not an addiction to sex. It's an intimacy disorder. And so many of my men, it breaks my heart to hear them. Like during the group, when we start working on attachment, that's what we work on right away in the first part of the workbook. And I use a video that was a research study done a long time ago and readily available on YouTube. But I have them watch it, and if possible, to watch it with their wife. And it's a mom and a baby. And she obviously is attached to her child, and her child is attached to her. But part of the study is they have the mom turn away. And then you watch the baby flail and squeal and cry. Mama turns back around. They go through that a couple of times. And when the men watch that, they tell me some of them start to cry. Some of them cry in group when they share it, because for the first time in their life, they finally know what it is they're looking for.
Mm.
And, my former husband said, we are like wounded little boys walking around in grown-up bodies, looking for a place to plug in. That deep need and longing for emotional intimacy is in all of us. But the way we learn how to do that with other people is during the first couple of years of our life with our primary caregiver. And there are some that find it later through an uncle or a friend, somebody who really takes them on as an adult child, and they can learn it. But all the men that recognize they need this and register for help are men who recognize they don't know how to meet their wife's need. They don't even often know what she's talking about. So they really, really need help. It's heartbreaking, that a man can beat the addiction and do all the work and hang in there with his family and then fail.
Yeah, yeah, you had said that, I mean that makes a lot of sense to me. Sex addiction is not about sex, and that it is an intimacy disorder.
Yes, yeah.
Um, a couple things come up for me. I'm hoping, can you elaborate just a little bit more on what you mean by that? I know you've touched on it, but if you can elaborate on that just a little bit more on what you mean as sex addiction as an intimacy disorder.
Okay. Well, there's a treatment center that when a man really needs long-term treatment, I ask the men if they would consider going to. And it's in Nashville, but they don't treat sex addiction. They treat intimacy disorder.
Mm.
So they approach it the same way I do. That it's if we don't get that connection, like go back to the baby, the mama turns her back, and then the baby starts to squeal, and then she turns back and she's lovey-dovey again, then she turns her back again. It's a picture of the kind of parenting we can have. A lot of people, their mother never connected with them, never bond. They took care of them, but they didn't bond because they weren't bonded too. So they didn't know how to pass on what they didn't have. And the only way we get it is if we can get it from another human being. That video says far more than I could ever explain, because you can see it in the baby's eyes. And then you can see, and some of the men whose mothers were alcoholics or mentally ill or something, they really relate to that baby video because their mom would connect. One man told me when we left home in the morning, when mom had given us a good breakfast, she'd packed lunch, she'd hugged us and kissed us and told us goodbye. So she knew how to bond,
Mm.
but she was an alcoholic. By the time they got home from school, she was horrible. She was turning over beds and throwing chairs at them. So that creates a really distorted view of bonding. You're afraid to connect because what if the person turns on you? So the intimacy disorder, very few, I think it's 25% of the population, it might be even less than that, have the kind of good attachment bond that we need from childhood. I'm blessed because I was well loved. Either none of us were perfect, and my parents weren't either, but we knew we were loved, and they told us so. But except for people who grew up in homes like that, they don't know what we're talking about.
Yeah.
Is they don't know how to connect, heart to heart, soul to soul, eye to eye with another human being. And I took it for granted.
Yeah.
And so I slowly, in the course of the workbook and the groups meetings, we begin, I combine it with the partner's trauma, because unless a man can really comprehend how he has shattered her view of marriage and her marriage and herself and of him, they can't be empathetic. But then I need to teach them how.
Mhm.
And in the groups, we bond. Very often the men continue meeting when I'm finished, and they like that bond.
Yeah. You had said, many people grow up, being raised by their parents, but not really ever bonding with them. And I related so much to that when you said that. I mean, my parents did the best they could. They're not that they're good. I think that they're good people. I don't think that they're bad people. Were they perfect? Absolutely not. You know, but even I've had conversations with people even still today. I sometimes I feel like I don't really know them, you know,
Oh,
and I have struggled with empathy, and I see these blocks that come up, and the fear and
yes.
the anxiety and the just the fear of just being so vulnerable, you know. Here is all of me. This is everything I am. Like, please be kind to it. And it can be really challenging in the wake of infidelity,
Yeah,
because now you're coming and you're trying to bare your soul
yes.
to the person who is
Oh,
very upset. Basically, you're bearing your soul to the person whose world you just destroyed, and that can be really challenging, you know.
thank you.
um
Can I add to that?
yeah, please.
I don't work with men who don't have sobriety down.
Mhm.
And I'm always hoping that the wives have done a lot of healing. But generally, we don't start with empathy. You got to start by getting sober and all of that. And she has to heal. But it's funny, last night I got a text right before I got into bed from a couple that I worked with years ago, and they were texting me about another couple that I worked with years ago. They've done everything. They've done lots and lots of work, and they're a couple years out from the tragedy. And it was a tragedy, and he really created a mess out of their lives and their children's lives. But she loves him, and he's a great man, a great dad, and a great husband, great provider. But she's stuck. She she won't leave the marriage because she loves him and she wants her family, but she's like she can't stay. So it's hard to help a marriage that's like that. Um, I generally don't work with freshly wounded partners of addicts. And I really don't want to work with men who haven't got sobriety down because they don't have space, until you're no longer acting out, you don't have the capacity
Yeah.
to think about another person or to focus. And your sobriety is wobbly at best in the beginning. So it can take a little time before they're ready for that.
Yeah, and I could see that, because if you're still acting out, you can't truly be vulnerable.
When you can't truly care about anyone else because your drug of choice, your brain is saying, I need more, more of that feel good hormone.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. And you had said that only 25% of people get that type of nurturing and care and love that, that we as human beings need as a
Need.
child need.
Mhm.
Um, you know, And I guess my question would be, and I'm assuming you mean that for all people, both men, women, whatever gender, right? Um, so do you find that men are more um predispositioned toward this lack of empathy? And if so,
Uh,
why do you think that that is?
okay. I don't know if predisposed to it are is the right way to say it, but a couple of things that I really, really think point to the reason. So many men are raised with big boys don't cry.
Right.
Shut that up, or I'll give you something to cry about. You're suck it up and be a man, 4-year-old, suck it up and be a man. Uh, we're in parents and in the culture where boys are taught to differently than girls by and large. Not 100%. I've had a lot of women clients who were treated that way too, but more boys than girls. And then the other thing I think that I believe, and it came out of the same researcher, Dr. Sue Johnson's work, um, and I include this in the workbook and have the men watch it and ask that they watch it with their wives. And then I ask a lot of probing questions and they have to answer them. But Dr. Sue Johnson, they did an evaluation. I'm assuming they did brain SPECT scans during a sexual interaction, but she doesn't detail it. But they wanted to see, when does the female's brain release, I think it's oxytocin. It's some kind of a feel-good drug, but I think it's oxytocin. And when does the man's release it?
Mhm.
Fascinating. The woman's brain releases it during foreplay, the talking, the snuggling, that part of it. The man's brain does not release it until ejaculation.
Wow.
So men are predisposed to connect intimacy, that feel good hormone, with the actual act of sexual intercourse. One of my brothers, I lived with he and his wife for 4 months, a few summers ago. And he honestly is not a sex addict. He's only has sex with 2 people, he says, and they've both been his wives. But he said, he said, if I lay down, and he coached in my ministry for a while, so we really got close. But he said, if I lay down at night, it's either to go to sleep or to have sex.
Yeah.
And he said, I don't need foreplay, but Christy does. So it's important to me because it's important to her. But he said, I don't need that. And that's a brother who was raised the way I was raised,
Right.
with lots of attaboys and hugs and kisses. And so that doesn't seem fair to me. that men are treated differently, boys are treated differently, and the male brain actually works differently. But it does give us a glimpse at why you struggle to meet a wife's needs. You know what she's talking about.
Yeah. And I mean, and it's interesting to think about like the way, I mean, because I feel like society is kind of in a shift as well in the
Yes.
way relationships, what people want in relationships, what men want in relationships is, and especially what women want in relationships. Women
Mhm.
want more of that
Mhm.
emotional intimacy more
Do.
than they ever have before. And it's a valid thing for them to want, you know?
We
Uh,
all need it.
and we all need it. And that's the thing is and it's funny because I'm listening to you and I'm like, and the men need it too. And they
They
just
do.
don't think that they do.
They think it's the physical intimacy.
Yeah.
And I know that's because their brains are wired the way they are, that release of chemistry doesn't happen until later for them.
Yeah.
So I've never said this before, I've never really thought of it this way before, but if you were to do an equation with emotional intimacy equals, what plus what, the woman would put two things, the man would only put one, intercourse.
Yeah. No, I mean, I understand that. You know, that makes a lot of sense to me. Um, you know, um, yeah. And the interesting thing about that is that we're both after the same thing,
Absolutely.
connection,
Yes.
right? Like we're both
Connection.
looking to connect.
Yes.
We just connect. We just have different ideas of what connection is.
Yes.
And
Yes.
and yeah, so and that's so interesting to think about it that way. Yeah. Um
The good news is you can.
No, that's great. And that I guess that would lead me to my next question, right? I know your program is focused primarily on teaching men empathy, something that
Mind.
they were never taught how to have growing up.
Yes. Yes.
What do you find is some of the biggest roadblocks on that path to empathy? Do some people find it more difficult than others, or is it kind of like 2 + 2 = 4?
Let me just correct something you said before I answer that. I
Okay,
have I have a team,
okay,
and we still serve women too.
okay.
And I serve couples who want it and who need it. It's just my slice of the pie at this point in my life is helping men learn empathy.
Right.
Um, People who are neurodivergent or Asperger's or somewhere on this spectrum, even if they're high functioning and they have a job and they, have a family, uh, those men that I've worked with have a harder time. The anxiety that is there for them about, it's like performing for their wives. They know that she's waiting for this magic to happen. And I've had one or two marriages I'd love to check back on to see if they've made it. But on the other hand, I have a neurodivergent now, a
Mhm.
man now, and I talked to his wife last week, and everything's changed.
Yeah.
But even in the group process, you can see that it's a struggle to verbalize. And then the other category, I've only had two men, I think, in that category. There are men, there's one in particular, the whole self-actualized, I'm a self-made man. Um, because he never got the warm fuzzy part, all he got was the black and white part.
Mhm.
That's what he's content with giving.
Yeah.
And he didn't give up his addiction. He was only sober for 4 months, unbeknownst to me or his wife or anybody. And so those marriages, I don't think there are very many people that stumble into wanting to learn empathy and being willing to pay for it, who are lying about their sobriety. But I have had a couple of men who just were not interested.
Mm.
And they know they don't, they're married on paper and that's it. They live separately.
Wow. Wow. What do you what do you find? So let's talk about the man who is interested, right? Like, let's talk about the man who just really struggles with empathy, but really wants to be able to show up that way for their wife. I know for me, I had a really hard time verbalizing, and I still have trouble verbalizing how I feel, how I think she feels, letting her know what I heard her say. Um, and what I found is that it was a lot easier for me to write, right? Now, the problem with that was that when I did the writing, it didn't have the same, it didn't provide her with the same energy
Right.
that me sitting before her eye to eye, emotions flowing, right? It didn't allow me to go in and take her pain away, you know? And so I see that there's a lot of power in what you had said, verbalizing.
Yes,
So
yes.
for the man who is in that place, who really truly does care and really truly does want to show up for his wife, but just for
Doesn't have a
whatever
clue
reason has these blocks in place, what would you say to that man?
that you can learn.
Yeah.
It's the men tell me it's as hard as learning Chinese, even harder because empathy is contorted. You know, it's on again, off again, hot, cold, push, pull.
Yeah. Can you elaborate on what you mean by that? The push pull,
If the people who loved you,
right?
i.e. your parents, love you part of the time, or it feels like they love you part of the time, and part of the time they don't, you become afraid to connect because it means people will let go, or you won't know, you won't be able to trust.
Yeah.
So you do your best at being nice usually, but you don't know how to meet that need.
Yeah. And I imagine there's because my family dynamic wasn't necessarily like that, but I'm sure that there are a
Yeah.
large variety of family
Yeah.
dynamics and the way that we grew up that play into that exact idea and that
Yes.
exact trauma, if you will, of not getting what we as human beings need. Yeah.
You know, as you were talking about um wanting to give that to your wife, and then wives are hurt and angry, it's usually a step two, learning empathy. I mean, she's shattered, she's got to get some healing under her belt before she's going to be able to safely open her heart
Yeah.
to something as risky as emotional intimacy.
Yeah, no, and that's I'm glad you say that, because I think that that's really important for people to understand because, if there's, yeah, I mean, there's definitely healing that needs to take place on both sides.
Yeah.
And and the betrayed partner has the bulk of the work to do.
Yes and no. She's been shattered in a way that you haven't.
You
But learning empathy and staying sober, when you've only had one way to meet your emotional need for connection,
know?
it's hard to, the brain has neural pathways well established. And creating new neural pathways doesn't happen overnight. So it's hard for both partners. I have found, though, that for the betrayed wife, if she can understand what why the addiction happened, his desire to have emotional intimacy, and he thought because of the way his brain's wired and because of what he heard growing up, he didn't understand that it was going to shatter you. All the men tell me that they knew they shouldn't do it and that they wanted to keep it a secret, but they had no idea it would shatter her into a million pieces the way it did. And one thing that's really surprised me as I've worked with men is they love their wives. The men that ask me for help desperately want to hang on to their marriages. They don't want to live, they're losing families usually too, and half of their earthly wealth. Some of these men are in their 70s, late 70s, and everything is on the line. But they love their wives. They didn't mean to hurt them.
Yeah.
And it's really hard for us as women to get that.
Yeah. I mean, and understandably so.
We're wired differently, aren't we?
Understandably so. I can't tell you how many times I have known what I have felt and been unable
To
to
say,
express, display, convince, prove.
true, yes.
Prove is probably a better word than convince. Um,
Yes.
what I was actually feeling about my wife,
Yeah.
and when she's looking at the actions, when she's looking at everything that you have done, everything that you are doing, it doesn't make sense to them.
No, it doesn't. Yeah, and because I've been through it myself,
Yeah.
and I've also been in a long-term relationship that did not have emotional intimacy. So I know how your wives feel. I lived with that for a very long time. And I've been single for 20 years. I'm not lonely, but I'll tell you what, I was in that relationship. So I know what they're talking about when they want intimacy. Fortunately for me, the addict in my life is, he's a therapist. He's emotive too. He needs connection too. So I didn't go through what your wife and a lot of wives go through, that they didn't come in a 2-for-1 package. But I feel I understand.
Well, that's, gosh, this has been really just amazing, powerful. You've said some things that were just made me feel not so alone.
You're
So
not,
I'm
you
hoping that
are
our
not.
audience will feel the same way. And before we go, is there anything else that's on your heart, on your mind that you would like to share and leave our audience with?
I just want to give them hope. If you're the one who did the betrayal, if you want to beat this, you can. There's quite a bit of help out there now for the addicts. And I guess I want to plug that treatment center. The men that I've worked with, they start to get childhood memories as we go through the group process, and they're digging around inside, figuring out what they feel, and then their childhood can get in the way. And I've had 7 or maybe 8 men go to that treatment center this year because they recognized, um, they felt, this is where this whole thing came from. I was this wounded little boy, and they start having flashbacks and memories come up of, like, one man got in a horrible car wreck as a teenager, and he got in trouble. When his dad showed up, he didn't pay attention to the cuts and bruises and bangs on his son. He was furious about the car. So, they want connection. They've just never had.
Yeah.
And for people who are really stuck in that place, going to treatment is expensive, but it's probably no more expensive than 5 years of therapy outpatient. So I've seen these men come back so excited and in a completely different place. So don't give up. If your childhood or your pain or your lack of empathy or lack of skill keeps getting in the way, there are resources, and there are a lot of resources for partners now.
Yeah.
So don't give up.
Thank you so much, Marsha.
You're welcome.
That's a
Thank
wonderful
you.
thing to say. Thank you. And I do just want to take a moment to thank our audience for being with us. You can find more information on Marsha Means and her link down below. You can find out more about the work that she's doing, more about her empathy coaching program. Highly recommended. And thank you again, Marsha. Thank you so much for being with us today. It's been such a pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you.